the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to focus about forceful variations. That's perhaps one of the most important things in chess, to be accurate with your calculations. Now, I'd like to point out something very important that not all people understand, even some pretty advanced players such as masters or international masters. A lot of people have the misconception that you need to calculate all the time every move in chess. Yes, to some degree it's true, but in reality is that in many positions, especially when it's a strategical, quiet type of position or close type of position, oftentimes you just need to trust your instincts and make a move that you feel is right, that fits in to the needs of the position, following the basic principles of chess, such as, for example, occupying an open file, or developing your pieces, or getting ready to castle, or, for example, doubling up your opponent's pawns by an exchange, or the list goes on and on and on. Not in every position you need to calculate much. However, on the other hand, there are situations that are tactical kind, and therefore in those situations it's extremely important to calculate accurately and then to come to the correct evaluation of the end of that variation. Depending on your level, you may be ready to calculate only 2 or 3 move combinations or variations. If you're at a higher level, you may be looking into 4, 5, 6 or longer variations. Regardless of the length of the variation, the important thing is that you're accurate with your evaluation. So that's what we're going to focus on in this lesson. Let's start right away with our first example, which is just out of the opening. In this position, Black has just moved his pawn from h7 to h6, attacking White's bishop on g5. Is this a good idea? Well, not quite, but you can only come to that conclusion after a precise calculation. Now, you only need to really calculate variations that involve forceful moves. Because if White would not have the option of capturing, for example, the knight on f6 or Black's bishop on h5, if the choice only would be to retreat the bishop to e3 or d2 or c1, you would simply need to trust your instincts without spending too much time on where to go. If you feel the bishop belongs on d2, bring it there without spending 10 minutes on that choice. Or if you think it should be on e3, same goes with that. Hopefully, you would understand not to retreat the bishop to c1, which would be developing backwards. However, in this case, White can do better by tactics. So let's try to figure out what can White do here. If White would capture the Black bishop on h5, Black could simply recapture. Now the White bishop would be under attack, and after the exchange of bishops, Black would solidly protect the pawn on e5 and be okay. So the only variation that White would need to calculate in this position is only capturing the knight on f6. What would happen after that? As we know, generally, I do not recommend to exchange a bishop for a knight for no reason. So therefore, it's important to do the calculation and make sure if there is a reason, whether to do it or not. So, after bishop takes knight, it's not very hard to recognize that if the Black bishop recaptures, or even the Black pawn from g7, the other bishop on h5 will be hanging, and then it's certainly a good deal. Another very important message is that you should always be on the lookout for your opponent's best moves as well, not just the moves that you'd want your opponent to play. Or don't be happy that this variation works. Always assume that your opponent has something up his sleeves. So, after bishop takes the knight on f6, what do you think black should try? Well, black should try to save his bishop that would be hanging on h5 or trade it off for an equal value piece. So what I'm talking about is bishop f6 and then bishop from h5 capturing on f3. Now that looks like a tricky situation because then after, let's say, queen captures back, also the black bishop will capture back on f6, resulting only in exchange between the minor pieces of the white bishop on g5 and the white knight on f3 versus black's bishop on h5 and knight on f6. However, white can do better. After bishop takes f6, bishop takes f3, white can make an intermediate move and sacrifice his own queen, capturing the black bishop on e7. And now, if queen takes back, white is up a knight. Or, after bishop e7, if now black captures the queen, then of course white will also capture black's most valuable piece. If either of the black rooks captures the white bishop on d8, so would white the black bishop, again leaving white with an extra knight. And after bishop c2, white will also capture black's pawn and be ahead in material. So, going back to our starting position, it was important to foresee that on the end of the day, white will come out ahead. Otherwise, we may choose not to give up our bishop for a black knight. Let's see our second example. Here we go. In this position, it is white's turn. It's a very interesting situation because black's rook is hanging on f3 and so is the black knight on c7. So what should white do? The most natural move, that is capturing the black rook on f3, wouldn't be white's best choice at all because the black knight could capture the white knight, and very importantly, that would immediately protect the black bishop on e3. And now, if you do the material count, you'll notice that black has a bishop and a knight for white's extra rook, and the pawn count is even. Capturing black's knight on c7 wouldn't give white any gain either, because black could simply exchange the rooks on f1 and then capture the pawn in the center on d4. On the other hand, white has a very important intermediate move, namely moving his knight away from the attack by a check, forcing black to get out of the check. And now, even though the white knight is under attack, white comes out ahead because after rook takes rook and king takes knight, also the black bishop is hanging. And now white is up an exchange. And now let's see the next position. Here we go. In this example, black is a pawn ahead, and therefore they would be quite happy to exchange the queens. And in fact, black is offering right now that trade by moving his queen to g4. What should white do? Well, typically the first response would be definitely do not trade queens, since black already has the material advantage. Moving the queen away from the exchange is certainly an option, but that would miss the winning opportunity. White here has a very forceful move that actually accomplishes a lot. Before you go any further, I suggest you try to pause this lesson and figure out the correct move on your own. Then come back and listen to what the correct move is. White has a very tactical move, and that is to move the knight to d5. This immediately attacks black's bishop. Also, it attacks black's knight. That means that if the black bishop right now retreats to d8, for example, white with a check is able to trade knights and then can capture black's unprotected queen on g4. Going back to this position, let's examine what would happen if the black queen retreats to protect the bishop on e7. Then white will win significant material because of the pin on the g7 pawn. The best choice is to capture black's knight on f6 immediately, threatening with checkmate with queen g7. And of course the point is that after bishop takes bishop, knight takes, wins the black queen because of the pin. Let's see another variation after knight d5. What happens if the queen retreats to e6, not to d7? Then the problem is the natural rook h to e1 that creates an immediate skewer and then winning the bishop on e7. Of course, it's important to notice that black cannot successfully block this attack because that all of a sudden would open up the bishop's power from b2, allowing the checkmate with queen g7. And finally, after knight e5, what would happen if queen takes queen? Again, the intermediate move, and that's the key idea in this whole position, not capturing the queen back immediately, but first capturing the free unprotected piece with a check, and only after the king moves out of the check, then pawn takes pawn, leaving white with the extra bishop. A very nice example. Let's see our next example, where it is black's turn. In this position, white is offering the exchange of rooks. First, I guess the most natural thing to look for is what happens if black ends up exchanging the rooks on f2 and then try to win the rook by giving a check. Again, a typical example that it's absolutely crucial not just to look for your good moves, but constantly also your opponent's as well. Right now, of course, white should not move the king out of the check, but should simply block with the queen, and that would result in saving the rook. That means that the immediate trade on f2 is not the best idea for black. On the other hand, black can create a pin over the rook on f2. In fact, black can create a pin on that rook in 3 different ways, from moving the queen to c5 or d4 or e3. However, only one of them accomplishes the goal, that is to win material. Again, try to pause the lesson and figure out on your own which of the 3 queen moves of black is the right one. If the queen, for example, moves to d4, attacking the rook in all reality a 3rd time, white could simply retreat the queen and be safe. On the other hand, if the queen moves to e3, you realize that after the only defensive move that white has, queen e2, after the exchange of queens, all of a sudden the white rook will be hanging on f1. When you see pins around, it's usually a good sign. If you can pin one of your opponent's pieces and it immediately creates an attack on one of the pieces, it's certainly a move to look further into, see if it works. Let's see the next example, which is a very typical one for Sicilian defense, especially for the Sicilian dragon. In this position, it is black's turn. Black has an opportunity to win a piece. The question is how? Well, one hint I can certainly give you. by forceful moves. Forceful moves typically relate to either a check or a capture, or it could be attacking an important piece. Well, here black has no way to check white's king, however has two possible captures of an important piece, either the bishop or the knight. The question is, in which order should we capture them first? Capturing the bishop first in this case is not the correct choice because after queen takes back, the rook is well positioned, protecting the knight on d4. So how about checking the other one? That is knight takes knight. What do you think? Is that the correct move? Yes, it certainly is. And the reason for that is that if now queen takes back, then we got a free bishop on h6. But that's not quite the end of the story. After knight d4, white can be trickier than that and try to exchange the bishops first, and only if king takes back, then queen takes, maintaining the material balance. Unluckily for white, black can do better, again using the method of an intermediate move. And that is knight takes bishop check. If now either knight or queen recaptures, then king takes, and resulting in a gain of a bishop for black. Let's move on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, again, let's recognize the material balance, and we will see that white is up a pawn, but it is black's turn. Again, black needs to look out if there are any tactical ideas, any forceful moves. The first move to look at is to exchange the queen, see if there is a follow-up after that. We can quickly recognize that that would not be a good idea because there is no tactical motive after that. On the other hand, white is a pawn ahead, and therefore, generally, black should not be looking for exchanging pieces. The only reason that black would be looking to trade queens is to avoid losing material. For example, moving the queen away from the attack of the white queen would not be great because then the bishop on d7 would be hanging. So in addition to moving the black queen, what other reasonable option does black have? Well, there is a good one, namely to block the threat towards the black queen and immediately at the same go attack the white queen. Now this is all good and dandy. However, the question is, what happens if right now the white queen moves away with a check, with an intermediate move, with the idea that if now the black king moves out of the check, the bishop is hanging. Uh-oh, is this a problem? Is it even worse than it would have been to trade queens? Not quite, because black again can block the attack, block the check, and counterattack at the same time. Now, not only that the white queen is attacked, but so is the white rook. Again, a typical situation that don't stop the calculation prematurely. As long as you see a dangerous looking forceful move for either side, try to continue with the variation. Only so you can come to the correct conclusion. Otherwise, it's kind of gambling and you may be surprised. Now the key move is knight d7. All of a sudden, the queen is hanging, the rook is hanging. For example, if queen takes rook, knight takes, and then, depending where the king goes, but the bishop is hanging. On the other hand, black can do better with a discovery check by playing e2. Now the black little pawn is about to get promoted. Even if the knight captures on c5, the pawn promotes to a queen, and then the bishop captures the queen. Let's see now a game between two of the top players of current times. This is a game between Veselin Topalov from Bulgaria against Peter Liko from Hungary. In this position, black is up a bishop. However, it looks quite dangerous, black not having a pawn on g7, that is, having an open g-file. Indeed, if the black bishop would need to move away, white's attack may get dangerous. However, black has an important intermediate move. Again, when we talk about intermediate moves, it's typically a very forceful, aggressive move. Try to find out what that move should be. Black can create a pin, which is quite important because it restricts the mobility of the rook, and moreover, it forces at least one of the other white pieces to defense. White continued by protecting the rook with the other rook, and black followed up with a very strong move, bishop f4, attacking white's rook and protecting the pawn on h6. Of course, now you need to be aware that white can give a fork, check with the queen, and when king moves out, capture the bishop. Did black just plunder a bishop? Of course not. The rook now can capture on d4 using the pin that we created. And now white is in trouble. The rook will be lost. Topalov captured the pawn, king moved out to e8, and white is helpless against saving the rook. By the way, the game continued with rook e6, when white was hoping for perpetual checks after takes, and then the queen would just keep giving checks on the 6th rank. But black would not be forced to capture the rook. In fact, black Liko continued by moving simply the king out of the check, and then white lost the rook, and in a few more moves the game as well. And that brings us to our final example of this lesson, being played by two grandmasters, Maurice Ashley and the French grandmaster Bacrot. In this position again, it was time to look for something aggressive for black. Even if you end up not playing it, or it doesn't work, you should be aware of your aggressive moves. See if they lead anywhere. In this case, black's correct move is to play f5, immediately going after the bishop. With the idea, depending what white plays, for example, if the bishop moves away, black can play f4, trapping the bishop. And now, if bishop takes knight, not recapturing, which would lose the pawn on f4, but the intermediate move, pawn takes on e3, and then capturing the other bishop on g6. After f5, white responded with bishop g5, a very sharp-looking move attacking the black queen, moving the bishop away from being trapped. And now the amazing move is, after which white resigned, another intermediate move, not moving the queen away from the attack, but counter-attacking white's queen. If now bishop takes queen, black would do the same, and all of a sudden, 3 of the white pieces would be under attack. Obviously, white would lose at least one of them. If instead of bishop takes queen, white plays b4, then black's idea is bishop takes pawn, and if queen takes bishop. Now the white bishop from g4 has to be very careful where to go, not to get checkmated on g2. And after bishop h3, knight f4 would result in a winning position for black. Very nice tactic. Well, I hope I gave you some good ideas that you will be able to use in your own games. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.